Well, welcome to For Science Biotech and Health Extension Salon Seminar Series. I'm really, really happy to see so many of you here. Thanks a lot for joining. And thank you, Eric, so much for joining. It was really, really wonderful to be connected to you. Thank you so much, Jim, for making it happen. And I first met you at a recent conference in Miami, which was on longevity technologies, where actually many people from the Bay Area were as well. So it was a really, I think, interesting conference. You gave a really, really fantastic kind of like plenary session there, really discussing how longevity innovation can happen from the other side that is often not discussed in this group, because we often focus on the science and technology part and really like driving that innovation forward at that side. But I think you do a really fantastic job to make sure that this innovation actually happens from the other end. So thanks a lot for the work that you do. It was really interesting to hear. And you are now the founder and the CEO of the Hargan Group, which is a healthcare consulting firm. But you served previously as the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, the HHS. It's really wonderful to have you here. But maybe you can share in a few words of your own, really what your kind of like career history was, so that people get a little bit of an understanding of the breadth of different roles that you've been holding, so that we maybe dig into a few of them afterwards. Thanks a lot for joining.
Sure, absolutely, Allison. So, to give you an idea, right now I'm doing my own consulting work here in Washington, D.C., but prior to that, relevantly, I was Deputy Secretary of U.S. Department of Health and Human Services here in D.C. in the prior administration. And those of you who aren't up on that sort of nomenclature for the government, which is a pretty small group of people that know what it is. Deputy Secretary, I was the Chief Operating Officer, essentially, of the department. So, and that means I was in charge of budget, operations, and regulations within the department. So overseeing the regulatory process at FDA or Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, and other of the regulatory agencies that fall under HHS like CDC and others. So about 26 divisions, about a budget of $1.3 trillion. It's about a quarter of the federal budget, and the largest department in the federal government, nearly twice the size of the Department of Defense, which is the second smallest department by budget in the federal government. Not the most number of employees. That would have to be the post office and the armed services and Homeland Security. There are a number of them that have more people, but in terms of budget, HHS is by far the largest department. So just for Medicare, Medicaid, National Institute of Health, other things, a very large enterprise within the federal government. So I was in charge of those side sorts of things within there. That was my second tour of duty at the department. I served there for several years under the George W. Bush administration as well, starting as Deputy General Counsel, Comment Regulations, and ending as the acting Deputy Secretary in that prior administration. In between, I was a partner at several large national law firms, actually in the health law and business departments of several large law firms. And I also right now I've been teaching since I left the administration at the business schools and policy schools for Vanderbilt, Cornell, and University of Minnesota, most recently for Minnesota. So I'm teaching, guess what? Health law and regulations. So not a big surprise. And that being my real background in this on the regulatory and reimbursement side. So while you all have been doing all the science and technology development, my world has been focused on the regulatory side, both the scientific regulatory side in terms of can the product be approved by the government and what sort of claims can a product make legally to be able to sell yourself, and then the reimbursement side, where you have who's going to pay for this. And the largest payer in the US is obviously the Medicare program from CMS, part of HHS. So that's the sort of setting for what I think hopefully be able to share with you about some of the issues that surround any product in the healthcare space. And longevity products have there are particular issues that should be considered when you're talking about the next step in what you're doing.
Yeah, maybe we can start diving into this. So perhaps starting with your tenure at the HHS, where you really oversaw a bunch of the challenges in getting regulation and guidance really across to help with longevity technology. So can you discuss a few of the challenges that you were through there and how to perhaps do that better from that side?
Yeah, it's a challenging area because with regard to longevity technology, first you have the FDA, right? So that's the top scientific regulatory agency within the HHS family. And you cannot market a product legally in the United States without getting FDA approval if you're going to make a claim, a health claim for structure or function of the human body. The issue with it is that FDA, to make sure that the product is safe and effective, which are the hallmark, sort of the keystone phrase for FDA approval, they have to obviously get information about it, data and clinical trials about how that works. Then one of the major issues, of course, from that point of view, is the amount of cost and time that has to be spent to prove those claims to the FDA. And under that is, what is longevity claiming? What is a longevity product claiming to do? If it's claiming to say, I will extend life or health span for a long period of time, then what is FDA going to say about that? How long will those clinical trials have to be? If you make a claim that I'm just going to make this up. Somebody has a healthy health span, 120 years. Okay. Who do you give that product to? And what are the milestones to prove to FDA that that is the health span that someone will live? Would you put someone in an 80-year clinical trial? Okay. Now that makes it obviously incredibly expensive and lengthy in terms of what you would have to prove to FDA to get to that point. Now, I'm not saying that anybody on here is talking about a health span of 120 years, but you can see at that level, if a claim wants to be made about a product, then you're going to have to prove it to some degree to FDA that you can give that to the consumer, both that it's safe, doesn't poison them, doesn't kill them, doesn't impair function, and also that it's effective. That is, that the claim that you're making for it is true. Now, with longevity, what is that claim? What is that central issue? When you come to something like, say, an oncology drug, you can say, here's the cancer that will be eliminated or mitigated or reversed, put into remission. How can I measure that? Here is an infectious disease drug. Here's how I can measure the presence of a virus or a bacterium in the body. Here's what it does. Here's an antitoxin. I can measure the level of toxin in the blood. But what is a longevity product, a drug, or a treatment trying to prove? And what is the claim that you want to make? So those are then, and you can break that down in any number of ways, but you see it at some point of abstraction, the claim that many longevity products are trying to make makes it very difficult for them to prove that claim to the FDA.
Yeah, I'm sure that perhaps in the Q&A we'll actually maybe hear from a few others that have really been that on that side of it. That would be interesting. Yeah, but I think
I can go into the CMS side. I could just lay that out if you don't mind.
Yeah, please go ahead.
The reimbursement side, because I want to get the basics out here. So then the reimbursement of a product. So a lot of times people will go at it hammer and tongs on the scientific and technological side and say, I'm going to get a fix for this particular issue. And that's great. The question is, aside from people that are going to do this, and they do obviously do this from a philanthropic point of view, if the product is intended to be paid for, one of the major payers is obviously the Medicare program. And particularly when you're dealing with the 65 plus patient group, that's the Medicare population. Those are those beneficiaries. And for them, it's whether something is reasonable and necessary. Those are the key words. The same way safe and effective are the key words for FDA. Reasonable and necessary are the key words that sort of animate CMS's attitude towards paying for particular goods and services in the program. And so they are going to look at it from that point of view. And when you think about it, when does this longevity intervention supposed to take place? Is it the 65 plus crowd? Maybe not. Sometimes people say, look, this will do best if you get it to somebody earlier in life. In other words, to arrest the aging process or slow it down before someone gets to the age that they're using Medicare. So who is paying for this? It's not going to be the Medicare program, except unless they're disabled, but let's not worry about that. If you're going to do that, you have to talk to the private payers. The private payers being, who we all know, places like Blue Cross, the various Blue Cross entities, United, Aetna, Cigna, Humana, so on, that are the main private payers. And within the private payment system, There's a variety of those kinds of things. For many cases, they operate as third-party administrators for employers. In other words, the employers are really underneath it, the ones paying for the services, and they're really just administered by the insurance companies who do the bargaining and the negotiation and the administration of those plans on behalf of the employers. So if you're an employee, now the question that comes up there is, and this is a very central question, is which kind of benefit am I providing and who is benefiting by it? Now, when you look at this, many times you can talk to a payer, and they used to be clients of mine. Some of the large payers used to be clients of mine as a private attorney. I'll tell you, give you a little bit of, pull the curtain back a little bit. How long do they think that an employee or a beneficiary of their plan is in their system? They generally will say about 2 years or a little bit less. So 2 years. Now, if what you're doing in there is you're saying, I got a cancer, or I was in an accident, or I have a particular condition, many of those conditions can be resolved or not, or treated in 1 or 2 years. I'm going to take this drug. I'm going to get this operation. I'm going to address some syndrome or some condition that I have. But what do you do about something like longevity? Longevity is not a year or two treatment. I don't believe, at least I've never heard of one, that solves it all in a year or two. So when you're trying to say, will you pay for this? You either are talking to one of these systems that's looking and saying, I really only got you for a year or two, sometimes less. And that's both the employers who have to count on how long is this employee going to be in the system, and I'm going to be taking care of them. And am I going to be really paying for something that someone else gets the benefit from? So the payers don't want to give a benefit, just to be completely candid, they don't want to give a benefit that someone else is going to be benefiting from. So when you say, I'm going to give you a 30-year benefit, but you're going to start it or pay for a large part of it, the setup, the initial start of these things, they're going to be looking at that with kind of a tongue in cheek about how they approach the reimbursement issues. So that's the intro to the regulatory side, the scientific regulatory side with the FDA and the issues there for longevity. And these are really basic issues. There's a lot more detail here. And then the basic reimbursement issue for why longevity has a particular issues with reimbursement and why they have issues with that.
Great. Before we perhaps try to discuss a few pathways of solutions or of at least ideas for what to do better, I just do want to kind of like perhaps open up the discussion a little bit more, and just like in general, I think that at least in the longevity community and like in many of our seminars, really it has been observed that there's many regulatory like kind of struggles with keeping pace with emerging technologies such as longevity technologies, like just in general. And do you have any kind of like general kind of ideas or thoughts on how HHS and its agencies can really ensure that the regulatory framework stays relevant in general, really in the face of technologies that are perhaps a little bit more rapidly emerging, such as longevity?
It can, okay. One thing is, I would say the more the word gets out about the usefulness of longevity. So I will say the last conference that I was at with you, Allison, and Jim, others, you had the presence there. Like there were starting to be the edge where this, and I've been going to these for a number of years, off and on. And in years ago, a lot of the discussions were very philosophical, right? They were very much, what would be the benefit of this if it happened? Or wouldn't it be great if these technologies were there? I see the area starting to very rapidly mature from a scientific and technological point of view of like, how would we implement these, and how can we show that these have effects, real ones, right? And starting to kind of like get, I would call very detailed and much more crunchy, is what I call it, about what these are going to do, and talking less about the kind of the fundamental science and the as I said, the social impacts of it, which are important. The reason why I continue to go to these kind of conferences, because I think it's very, very important. But it has gotten to the point where now introducing the practicality of what this is and what these technologies are aiming to do is, I think, going to be more important to sort of start connecting the dots in a more detailed way about what this means in front of not only the payers, but also the policymakers inside government at a much more, and I think a richer way, because in many cases, government is going to be one of the only ones governments are going to be one of the only ones who can sponsor these longer term objectives and try them out to see whether or not they would have the practical impact that would cause, say, the private sector to embrace them. Because the private sector does experiment on, yeah, that sounds like a bad word, but I mean, they are capable of doing sort of like figuring out areas in corporate wellness, like what works in corporate wellness, like what can keep your workforce happy, contented, out of the pathway of disease and aging that cause problems along the way. And while the longevity community has its eyes on something much more distant and of larger impact, right? Ultimately, a lot of people focus on the closer impact of these things on them, right? And as I said, I think ultimately, who wants this? Everyone wants it. Okay, the consumers want this. Everyone on the call wants this, right? And we all want this. And everybody you would introduce it to would say, absolutely, they'd buy it off the shelf if they could get one of these technologies that worked. The question is the people that pay for it, the people that are the third-party payers that kind of surround the money that's being handed out in healthcare, have a different set of incentives for what's going on here and a different idea about what their duty is for guarding that that money and handing it out in terms of the impacts that it would give to the patients.
Yeah, I do have to agree with
That
you.
wasn't too convoluted.
No, it's really useful. And I mean, I just want to totally second the point that you're making. I remember when we started hosting even just the science and tech oriented longevity conferences and workshops, and a few of them, of the people here even on this call were the first ones, even like 7, 8, 9 years ago. And they look very different back then. and it's been really encouraging, I think, to see just like how kind of like, yeah, how direct, how pragmatic, and how results oriented like progress has been recently. And now you can talk really kind of like in detail about specific technologies and specific advancements. And I think that must help with also giving like regulators and reimbursers a little bit of a better fine-grained understanding of like where we are in terms of progress. So I think that probably induces a lot of like sanity and just like concreteness and pragmatism into the discussion, I imagine.
And if there are mileposts along the way that you can go, long term, we expect it to do this, but in the shorter medium term, we expect this technology to do X, Y, Z, A, B, C. Like, what will be maybe the payoff is that health span that lasts out far beyond what we know now. But will a technology do something now? In other words, what would it take, and can we measure that change compared to what it would have been otherwise? Can you take, and it can be a very subtle point to be able to tease out what these technologies might do. And if you go, really, it needs to be 5 years, but does it need, or is it 2 years, or is it 10? Like, where will you see a measurable impact on the people that use these? And I think that's where kind of you get people start to think about it, whether it's in the private sector or the governmental sector.
Yeah, actually, that makes me very curious about what you consider the role of biomarkers in all of this to be. I don't know if you have an opinion on this, but they definitely come up in, I would say, almost every single one of our calls. And there recently has been like exciting progress with the Biomarkers of Aging Consortium and so forth that was established. But yeah, I'm super curious if you have any thoughts on it.
The biomarkers issue has definitely within the government, it definitely comes up within the idea both of NIH, so sort of the research, the pure research side of things on the various personalized medicine initiatives have the role of the sort of increasing focus on biomarkers, rare diseases. Is there such a thing as cancer? In other words, like people used to go, you have cancer. Then they're like, it's all these different kinds of cancer. Then actually, there's even within particular kinds of cancer, there are different groups and cohorts that respond differently to different medicines or treatments of various kinds. Like the idea is that the markets keep getting more personal, smaller cohorts as we understand more and more about the effects of a disease state on particular body or a particular person or a particular group of people. When those sort of areas start getting smaller and smaller, you start saying like how the people, there is more and more attention to the biomarkers, how you can measure them, what do they mean, how do they impact treatments, how does it being there impact a particular treatment. And so for a fact, the government has been working on this for quite a while. I mean, at least 20 years to my knowledge on the issues, but it started from obviously not very a not very sophisticated point of view. And but to address your question, how do you get the government sensitized to these kinds of technologies? How do you get policymakers in there? One is just keep talking about it, right? Just keep talking about it. Get officials, whether it's former officials like me or current ones, to come and listen and participate in what you're doing so that they have it in their heads what you're doing, and that there is a there, and that it is increasingly a there. And the same way that I'm talking to you about, here's how the government would think about it, because I spent by far the better part of a decade inside HHS and dealing with it on the outside for many, many years outside of that, is that so I'd kind of the framework that they're going to use, that they are going to see these issues the same way I'm talking about them and go, is this really something? So CMS will look at it and go, is this something for seniors, or is this something that had to be adopted before they become seniors? Is this something that will help the elderly? And what will it do exactly? And is it something, when they're looking at setting how much it costs? That's a real issue. And the more speculative something is in terms of its impacts, the less likely it is that it's going to be reimbursed by the government. And in many cases, the private payers follow the government's lead on these things, both in terms of will you cover it at all, and then how much will you pay for it, where they key off of Medicare rates in these cases. And obviously there are areas that the government doesn't do very much in: labor and delivery. Okay, there's not a lot done there. Pediatrics outside of this disability. There's a lot of areas where the government does not tread very much in the space. And the question is, what is this? What is it? And is there a difference between different longevity treatments? Some might be really for people who are younger in life, and some might be, hey, this is fine. We could give it to somebody who's 65 plus, in which case you have to think about the case to make for Medicare. How much does it cost? What are the benefits that it's going to bring to the beneficiaries? And then, do the beneficiaries want it? Because the government is influenced by what the beneficiaries, i.e. voters, want out of the system. And I cannot imagine, if you had something that was as plain as in its effects as some of these treatments might be, that patients, the consumers, the voters, all those being the same thing, are going to be very interested in it as a technology.
Yeah, and perhaps like in an ideal world, like what do you envision the future of like longevity medicine really to be in the US? If things can like roughly like tag along and the progress happens on the science and technology end, what do you see kind of like the role of regulatory and reimbursement bodies on the long run in like shaping these technologies?
Yeah, I mean, if you look, I brought together, I mean, that's my home territory, is venture capital, private equity. That was what I did as lawyers, M&A in the healthcare sector. So this area, yeah, but the question is, I think you were talking about the role, like sort of private equity and those kinds of things. I mean, you've seen people are getting into it now, right? This is venture backing, at least, has really appeared in the space at this point, right? And so you're starting to see it outside of philanthropy and governments and things like that. So there is something there that's developing. The closer, and it's a sort of a catch-22. The closer that you get to someone is going to do it and you have to think, when you come to reimbursement, you think of three things: coverage, coding, and reimbursement. For those of you, those three elements, if you're not familiar with them, coverage just means, will I get paid or not? Right? Essentially, yes or no. Coding shows the conditions on which it will be paid, like who will get it and under what circumstances, and to address what condition, say. And then reimbursement, how much will you pay? So there's three elements: yes or no, under what conditions, and how much will be paid are the sort of three. They have endless permutations, but you have to set up the technology for success to know what is the size of the market. Is it likely to be paid for? What's the size of the market in the coding sense, and how much ultimately will it be seen to be reimbursed for? And some of those things, they're imponderables, right? I mean, you cut in, we had various experimental technologies come in front of us when we were, and normally sort of the appointees like me wouldn't necessarily get involved unless it was a very sticky question, right? So, for example, CAR T, if you saw that sort of reimbursable product, very, very expensive. And what is its success? Where is it being covered? Because we could have broken the bank by covering it in all different circumstances. So the government thinks about these things quite a bit. Or we had, say, Spark. Spark was a blindness treatment. The blindness treatment did not solve 100% of blindness. It only restored 30% of sight, but it was to people that had never seen before. So when we were considering, well, it doesn't restore function, it doesn't allow the person who's blind to actually resume normal life. They can't drive, they can't hold down the jobs that people with sight can, but they could see light and dark. Now, should you pay for that? In this case, we decided, yes, pay for it. Why? Because we would never see progress in this area if we had to have somebody essentially shoot the moon and solve blindness 100%. And that's the only condition that we would pay for it. We decided to go ahead and pay for it, even though, because it had actual progress in it, and we knew we wouldn't get any more research and development in this space if we said no. We were basically, and the government does do that, where you kind of go, this gets us substantially down the road towards something that could then be improved on to solve a condition at some point. So that was a really big component of the discussion that we had in doing that. And so those kind of things, while they're not the sort of bread and butter decision making within the government, they really are considered. And I think that message from the Spark side of things might be something that you think about in the longevity space, where you're going to be, unless somebody just says, I got it, eureka. Like, our health span is going to be centuries and we just solved it all at once. I'm anticipating that this area, like most areas of medicine, will be some kind of incremental innovation. It will add to things, right? It will slow things down, delay things. That's what I hear going to these conferences, that there's, and being able to prove that out, I think, is going to be the central issue. In the same way Spark could show, we can see light and dark 30% of the cases, but it was light and dark. That's it. Didn't restore function. It was only 30%. And so, but it did do it, right? CAR T does not reverse every cancer, right? And it's differential impacts on different cancers, but it had a huge impact for where it was able to be used. Anyway, I'll stop there. I can talk about this stuff.
It's really interesting precedent setting, and like very encouraging that the government like stepped up there. That's really interesting. And there's probably like a few longevity like metaphors or individual technologies that could fit a specific that molds as well in longevity, and would be interesting to discuss perhaps a bit more in the Q&A, which they could be. But I also want to, perhaps as we're running down, and as I'm encouraging other folks in the audience to post their questions either into the chat or raise hands, I'll have maybe one or two more questions, but I do want to hear from you, just that, now in your new position and the Hargan group, and perhaps you can really wind down with this. What is your role there, and how do you help folks really there to navigate the complexities of the regulatory environment and secure reimbursements and so forth? What are you currently focused on, really?
Sure. So we do three things. We do policy and regulatory consulting, sort of advice. What does this mean? How can I do this thing inside the government? Intelligence, political intelligence. What's the administration or the Hill doing on something? But I don't do lobbying myself. And then business development, helping connect people to whoever, right? Because I spent a long time in the space, right, on the private sector as well as in the government. So the sort of doing those things. Now in this area, the sort of companies that we have helped, we kind of do a number of things. One is that, like I said, about coverage coding and reimbursement. Everybody's in a different circumstance in those, and you have to build allies and a whole network that sort of convince, I'll say, just take the government, Medicare, convince Medicare, CMS, the agency, that they should cover a particular service or treatment. And that involves a whole lot of things. Engagement, like who are the key opinion leaders in the space who would vouch for the technology? What has been said about it? If they were to do a search, what is this technology? Not just the technical FDA, it did this thing, but specialty medical societies. Are there specialty societies that would embrace the technology, that kind of stand behind it? Because they do react to these things in terms of what they do. And then also, if there's a code available, or is there something that you kind of be at the tweak or a reinterpretation, can you get coding to cover this so that you know the circumstances under which it would be covered? In other words, is there something out there already? Sometimes there's something to latch onto or a parallel that you can either use, get the agency to agree, yeah, that code actually works for this, or maybe they could change a word or two or add a phrase or take a phrase away within the code that says this changes it, right? And we agree, add this on. We have something like it, parallel, we added a few words here, this would actually work out. And so those kind of things, and then work on how much should this be paid for? Should be paid for this technology at the end of the day. What are the parallels to this? What are the benefits of it to the program? What are instances where something like this has been used before? So that would be some of the things, at least in this area, that I work with people on, the device companies and others, to say, here's how it might work.
Wow, interesting. So again, like a lot of like precedents and similar cases and examples that's really useful. And yeah, is there a particular technology or at least like area or something that you are particularly excited about right now as you like kind of looking into the space from the other side? What is there one technology that you think will kind of generally fits that bill well of the
Yeah,
different?
I think it's, do you pick a favorite kid? I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of this. I mean, just to that conference that we were at, there were so many promising technologies. I think that some of the conceptual work that has been done around combating aging, as opposed to saying we're all going to live forever, right? Because that gets people going. The ones that concentrate just more concretely on solving a problem that has an incidental benefit of increasing health span, and is, I think some of the conceptual work that's been done in the community is, for speaking as an old government hack, that's that's kind of the area of the space that I always look at, is the technologies that can fit into a paradigm that they're willing to embrace, that are hooked more closely to what they're already looking at. Can eventually the government take what it already does in aging and say, we can start looking at this in a different way than we had before, at a more fundamental level? And I mean, that was just like having Bob Langer at that conference speaking. You're like, there was a great example of somebody who helped change fundamentally several treatments and several fundamental technologies, but that at the time were very much frowned upon in the space, but convincing people over time that there are basic technologies out there that we're not taking advantage of already and getting them moved in that direction, like he did with the anti-angiogenesis drugs that are now pretty basic. But when they started out, everybody was just like, get another profession because you're totally wrong about this. As you may remember, I mean, he gave many instances, and it's well known now, but nevertheless, it's the same. People are the same as they were 30, 40 years ago. I mean, you have to constantly spur them towards innovation or things settle back to in the inertia that is already there, like a huge issue. In government or any human endeavor, inertia is a big enemy here. And sort of this isn't what we've always done, so I don't know why we should do this. And and in this area where you're trying to create really new technologies and apply them in a different way, you are fighting that inertia as well.
Yeah. But is there any topic that you think I should have touched on before we open it up to the Q&A?
No, I'd like to see what people are interested in asking.
Okay, wonderful. Then we have Steve Folks first. If you want to unmute, feel free to ask your question, and then I'll go down the list so far.
It wasn't really a question.
Okay, wonderful. Then
Okay.
I have Micah next with a question.
Do you know if there's any concern within the U.S. regulatory apparatus that people will move overseas, either with research and development or clinics, if the regulations are too stringent?
Okay, let me just say bluntly, no, not really, because the issue is, of course, the U.S. is one of the last areas that has a functioning development of new medical technologies. I mean, it is where it is. I mean, I remember talking to the German health minister years ago, and he said, we used to be the medicine chest of the world. And now it's all in America. And it has been for years. And while there are a few places, like there are British companies in space, Switzerland has some, no one really thinks that. There are places where technologies were developed overseas. Proton therapy, for example, took a long time to get here because the US had concerns about it. And it does happen with products now and again, but a wholesale move, no. And it would take a country, and obviously there are very sophisticated countries, and there are large countries like China that would desperately love to be the center of medical technology and innovation, but they have, I think, some fundamental scientific cultural issues to resolve probably before they even try to supplant the US. If it got to that, we're so far away from wholesale tech moving to, in this area, particularly moving overseas. They're not that concerned, no.
Okay, wonderful. Next one up, we have Jim O'Neill. So familiar face.
Hey, Eric. So let's look forward a few years and say FDA approves some great anti-aging treatments. They have really large effect sizes, very obvious. The public would get very excited, I think. Everyone would want these. Maybe they'd even say the ideal time to start this is age 30 or something like that, repeated every 5 years. But you could see CMS saying, wow, that looks really interesting, but it doesn't really fit in what we do. Like, what's the indication? You could see insurers saying the same thing.
Yep.
If that were to happen, I could imagine a lot of public pressure coming down on both the government and insurers. So could you try to sketch out what this sort of public pressure might look like and what might happen?
Sure. So yes, if something like that, a fundamental technology, there would be public pressure, right? Coming from all the patients. The issue would be, what vehicle could they adopt to do this? Now, and it's going to depend on the price pressure, to be honest. Like, how expensive is this thing? And would this create pressure on, say, opening up HSAs, health savings accounts, for consumers to buy it themselves and really blowing that up so that it is a consumer product? With the FDA, is it something, some of it's going to depend on, is it something that really has to be administered by a healthcare professional? That's one, right? Is it the kind of thing that is going to need intensive monitoring and a medical professional to really stay with the patient and do that. So that's going to be one thing, right? Would it be a technology that could really be used by anyone with ease and without much oversight? That's going to be one of the big clefts here, right? And what is the cost of goods to produce the thing, and the R&D that had to get paid off so that the people that did the work actually pay off, don't take a loss on the particular issue. I mean, that's going to be one of the tricky areas, depending on who's running things at that point. Is they go, oh, this is a public good, let's just make them hand it over and give it away, right? Or something like that. These are going to be real questions if something fundamental like that shows up, and then who should pay for it? In other words, like, the rest of the world's going to want it too, and what is going to be the pressures from overseas, assuming that this technology arises, like most of them do, in the United States, that it's discovered here, developed here, and all those kinds of things, which is the way to bet, even in the next 10 years, I would say. So how will that pressure rise? It's going to depend on the nature of it. Is it one of these things that it takes months to administer, you're in an infusion clinic being watched over by medical professionals, or would it be like, oh, here's a pill I can pop. I just take one of these, or something like that, that would have a very different valence for it. So, and that will show where the pressure could be applied, but it's going to be applied through, at least in DC, through trade groups and citizens and Congress is where this shows up. Like, where is this? And is it something that if they take it in their 30s, it reduces costs in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s of that person? And that can be quantified, if not inductively, through 50-year clinical trials, deductively, where we go, look, if we change this, it can't not result in lower cost for the program, which case there could be fundamental things that could be done here. And there could be switches in the tax law, changes where people could get incentives to buy it themselves, ways that, and obviously the employees will want this, and they will put pressure on their employers to offer this through their private employer plans. That is where a lot of things are driven, because the employers get heat put on them to cover something, and they respond to that. It's a competitive health insurance is a competitive advantage for many employers to get and retain their employees. Did I answer that? I'm not sure if I answered that completely, but
Yeah, good answer, especially the HSA part. Thanks.
yeah, I love the HSA. So that's one of my little hobby horses. So you'll hear that from me all the time. Use the tax system.
Wonderful. Thank you.
It's a consumer product. Everybody wants this.
Next one up, we have John Ferber.
Hi, Eric. Nice to meet you. It can take years for FDA to approve a new technology or new drug or new supplement. So I'm wondering, are you talking about reimbursements only for things that have already been FDA approved? Or would the government reimburse for experimental treatments if the patients or the subjects were volunteering for something experimental?
It can be pretty tough. I mean, that is a very tough issue, because day in, day out, the things like Medicare are not going to pay for things that aren't FDA approved by and large. So what you want is for it not to be the government doing this directly. That's why I love things like the health savings accounts, where people go, I don't care if it's off-label or unapproved. This is a healthcare issue, and I want to buy this with my money that I saved for healthcare purposes, and I'm going to have much more flexibility of doing it myself. Will the manufacturer or the researcher pay for people to be in experiments? I mean, that's a question, right? There's legal issues around that, about paying patients to be in a experimental system. If that's the question you're asking, there certainly are ways of working that out with institutional review boards and who pays for what, when, and where in terms of clinical trials. That's one thing. FDA does take a long time to get around to these things. And then CMS, many, many years ago, because oncology drugs, many cases are off label. That is that they're just things that people found helped with cancer, but their manufacturer never went through clinical trials for proving that it had an effect on cancer. So they couldn't make a health claim for it. And CMS years and years ago didn't pay for them. They didn't pay for some of the most effective oncology drugs. And Congress literally passed, as part of a bill, the OBRA many years ago, told CMS, you will pay for these oncology drugs off label, even though they don't have the right kind of health claim. So sometimes Congress will actually intervene and force the agency's hand to cover things that don't have the right kind of indication or approval. And so that, because it just became an issue that cancer treatment in many cases wasn't being paid for, was being rejected. And that caused public outrage, that caused congressional outrage, and caused a bill to be passed over CMS's head to require that to be paid for, which kind of gets to Jim's question as well, right? How can these things happen? That was an unusual circumstance. So don't think we'll just get Congress to pass the bill for a product. That doesn't happen very often, but it can happen, as I said.
I have a related question, which is, suppose I and a few other people decide we're willing to pay for it ourselves, but it hasn't been FDA approved. Is there a way for FDA to not prosecute the supplier?
Oh, okay, sure. Okay, as long as the supplier or manufacturer does not make a claim about that product, okay, as long as they're not advertising about it, putting in their labeling, so that if let's say you've got something that anti-aging, but it's really a product that's approved for, I don't know, blood pressure. Okay, say something's approved for blood pressure, but you find out it's got an anti-aging component if it's paired with X, Y, and Z. Okay, the manufacturer can sell you that any day, and FDA is not going to prosecute them for it. The doctor can prescribe it to you legally, and you can use it. The doctor could do any of these things. Doctors do this all day. They prescribe things off-label that the medical community, academic community produces papers. This drug is good for that. That drug's good for that. The difficulty is if the manufacturer of that product makes that claim without getting the FDA's approval, they're in trouble. You're not in trouble. The FDA does not regulate the practice of medicine. It is barred from doing that. It is not a United States Board of Health or United States Board of Medicine. It does not have that power. It is specifically kept away from that power. So you cannot be prosecuted by the FDA unless you own that product and become a distributor of it that says, I'm going to make all these claims about it and I'm going to go advertise it. I'm going to put out flyers. I'm going to put it on radio, TV ads, and so on that say, hooray, this can do this thing, and I'm going to make it and sell it. Then you get in trouble with the FDA. That's very basic. I'm not acting as a lawyer here. Okay, so talk to your counsel. I'll be like one of those ads for FDA. Consult your lawyer.
Yeah,
Before
that's always good advice. And
consult your lawyer before using. Okay.
Can I ask a really quick follow up on that? If someone else advertises on your behalf, not because you asked them to, just because they went out, they got it, they talk about it with their friends, they go on social media, broadcast, does that ever come back and hurt the distributor?
If the distributor or the manufacturer does not participate in this thing at all, okay, that their salesmen don't go out there and go, look at this. And even so for example, if it were the other way around, pretty much all of academic medicine would all be in jail by the FDA. Okay, they pick up drugs and techniques and devices and use them for all kinds of stuff. Okay, all day long, and they write papers about it. That's how they advance in their profession. They literally toot the horn about all the neat things that they've discovered about something. Happens all day. Okay, FDA does not try to put them in prison. Okay, and they're talking about off-label, undiscovered uses of something. Okay, and they print it right out in broad daylight. Why doesn't FDA pick them up in a paddy wagon and take them off to prison in Bethesda? It's not illegal. Okay, so they can't do that. And And now there are limited circumstances where a manufacturer can say, take a reprint of an academic piece of literature and hand it out, okay, as a fact. I think there will be more developments in this space, but it's not there yet. And the Supreme Court has not said that the First Amendment means that the manufacturer can say whatever they like as long as it's truthful. We're not there. We're not there. FDA still has power over the introduction of those products into commerce by the manufacturer and the people around them. So yeah, but not you. I mean, if you say, I think this works, you're in the same situation as half of the academic medical community, more than half.
So my question was a direct follow-up to this.
Right.
I kind of anticipated exactly this line of thought. So imagine this happens. So we have something that gets approved for some condition, for some clinical indication. Maybe one of these biotechs in the aging field gets approval for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis or for chronic kidney disease or whatever, or blood pressure, to use your example. And so there's a drug on the market that's approved and considered safe because it went through phase 1 trials. But it's not approved for aging. And people are starting to take it like Micah and not get prosecuted, like you said. There are people whose job it is to save money for Medicare, presumably. And there are people whose job it is to tear their hair out because they're worried that Social Security is going to go bankrupt, right?
Yep, it is.
Those two sets of people have an incentive in doing their job to notice things that are likely to save money for those systems. Medicare, for example, is the exact opposite of the private insurer one you talked about, where they fear people switching. If they make people healthier through off-label use of this, right? So the individual physicians, of course, are incented to prescribe this new drug that we're talking about off-label for their patients to make them healthier. Is it possible there are some bean counters somewhere who are trying to save Medicare money who will actually say, hey, this is likely on a broader scale, if we approve this more than just for the people who get idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis or whatever, we could really save Medicare's budget. Is there a scenario in the future where maybe they put pressure on the FDA to expand the label and don't leave it all only up to the company, the manufacturer of the therapy?
So the two sister agencies, like they try to stay out of each other's way. In other words, and think about CMS, as you said, bean counters, it's full of people that really understand the payment system. So they're economists and payment experts, accounting, actuaries, those kind of people. There's a few doctors and scientists there, but it's not mostly those people. FDA is the exact opposite. They're not looking at the monetary implications by and large. They're looking at the science. So they're full of clinicians, doctors, researchers, and those kind of people that are going to look at the technical, scientific side of things with a regulatory point of view. The difficulty for Medicare affecting these is that it covers people 65 and older. And if you have a technology that really needs to already be put in place with some regularity earlier than 65, Medicare can't pay for that. So while they may end up saving money down the road, and that would be great, everybody would love that. Taxpayers should love it too. The issue is that the Medicare program doesn't cover 30-year-olds. And if it needs to be given to 30-year-olds, Medicare can't pay for it.
So on a high level comment that I'm making,
Medicare
a lot of context here is that the anti-aging space should always be remembered as being two halves. There's the part of it that's trying to slow aging. That's the stuff you give to the 30-year-olds, so they're healthier when they're 65. And there's the other part of the field where they're trying to reverse aging. Yes. That's the stuff you give to the 65-year-olds to give them the health of a 50-year-old instead of a 65-year-old. Yeah. That's the more likely off-label.
Yeah, if you end up with stuff with reversing aging, then that's where you get particularly the issues in that bedevil the program, which are chronic disease states. So if you can get rid of that monstrous vast majority of spending that goes into chronic disease, particularly all the things around obesity, metabolic syndrome, hypertension, dyslipidemia, all the bad side effects of obesity, they will beat a path to your door.
Wonderful. We're now exactly at time, and I would hate to let you go without giving you perhaps like a final word of how can people help your efforts along? How can people, if they're like excited about the work that you do, find more out about your work, and any kind of like final bits and pieces how people could potentially follow up with you?
Yeah, you can always email me, eric@hargangroup.com, with any questions you have. And if you want to send along my contact, I think Allison, you probably have my contact info. Please feel free to send it to the group assembled here. Always happy. I know that I see 16 questions in the chat room, or 16 chats in the chat room, so I know we didn't get to all those, but happy to answer, talk offline, and please feel free to reach out. As I said, I think that this is an increasingly exciting area. And what we just talked about with this idea of reversal of aging, and particularly going to the central issues, you could both save the public fisc and give everybody longer, healthier lives. Everyone would, I think, beat a path to the doors of anyone that can do these things. It'd be a fundamental change in how we've approached it. It's just a question of when we get there, how we get there, and under what banner that is being flown over these technologies to allow them to be adopted and paid for. And that means the long-term sustainability from a financial point of view of these technologies. And that means the access that people have to them. Because if you don't solve the financial problem, you don't have long-term sustainability and access for people. And that's a fundamental thing that just has to be proven out. So, but anyway, like I said, Allison, if you don't mind, you can send my contact info out there to the group, and I will happy to answer the questions seriatim instead of in the group and one by one.
Absolutely. Thank you so much from everyone. I think I can really speak on behalf of everyone here. Thanks a lot for joining. This was very, very useful information, I think, for everyone in the group here. And I'm excited to hopefully welcome you again in the future. Thanks a lot for taking time. Thanks everyone for your good questions, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye everyone.